Hello everyone. This is the first video lecture of week 3, and the theme of this week is Before History, the Prehistoric Art in Western Asia. After last week's discussion of the history of archaeology, the beginnings of archaeology and archaeological practice in the 19th and early 20th centuries, I'm really excited to dive in, to jump in discussing particular materials in the prehistoric art. So we're going to really start with the earliest processes of the transition from the Paleolithic or the Upper Paleolithic, the kind of glacial period hunter-gatherer lifestyles to the lifestyles of the Neolithic settled communities, the agriculturalists. But of course, this transition really takes place over a very long period of time. It literally takes thousands of years, although oftentimes this process is really referred to by archaeologists and ancient historians as the agricultural revolution. But let's look at some of the objectives of this week. First of all, we're going to be in the first video lecture. I have three objectives for this week, and each of them actually correspond to the video lecture content that I will be delivering to you. So the first objective is to start looking at the Upper Paleolithic and Neolithic periods, prehistoric art in Western Asia in particular, and to especially start asking questions about sort of what are the debates in the study of prehistoric art. So the first objective is to bring to the table to explore some of the basic questions that are being really research questions that are being asked by scholars who are working on prehistoric art. For example, the idea of asking sort of what is an image, with the making of paintings on the walls of deep and dark caves, representation of animals, sometimes even representation of humans. We see sort of this emergence of the world of representation. So what does an image do? So that's one of the, what is the function? What is the meaning? What is the significance of the image in a cave painting, for example? That's one of the things that we're going to really start asking. And also another sort of group of artifacts that we're going to work with this week are figurines, prehistoric figurines, both from the Upper Paleolithic and from the Neolithic. And these are miniature humans and animals, and we want to ask the question, what does it mean to make a miniature human in clay or carve an image of a person from stone or ivory? So really a kind of a really question about what is prehistoric art about. We're also going to look at sort of the question of what is context. I'll talk about that in a little bit in this lecture. And also, what is the distinction between art and architectural history versus visual and material culture? You may have read in the beginning of your syllabus for this class, and we discussed this a little bit last week, is that in this class, we're not just looking at what would be nowadays considered art or architecture or monuments. We're also looking at visual culture and material culture, and what are the differences, and how does this idea of visual culture and material culture, how do those fields of research help us to study the ancient world? So we're going to talk about that. The second objective is really to go into particularly the idea of figurines and cave paintings, and to think about the impact of climate change on these image making practices and this art making practices and the lifestyles. We're going to be looking at thousands of years of history, sort of moving from a kind of living in small groups in a very glacial period when Europe and the Middle East is covered with glaciers. There are small pockets of land that you can hold on to. How does one sort of really see the transition when those glaciers start to melt, the Mediterranean starts to rise, you start to get these warm summer nights? What does that sort of climate change really imply in the new world? And we're going to look at a couple of really interesting sites where we see monumental architecture, and that particularly Göbekli Tepe, and that will be sort of really the beginning of the Neolithic for us. And in the third lecture, and the third objective for us is then to really get into the agricultural revolution with examples of a few sites from the Middle East, particularly Çatalhöyük and Ain Ghazal, to discuss the architecture, burial practices, this changing image-making practices in settled life when people transition into building villages in mud brick houses and living in mud brick houses and living in places year-round instead of moving across the landscape. So that's kind of really what we're going to do in the third lecture. We'll talk a little bit about the trade in obsidian, particularly, and which is a very powerful material in the material culture of the Neolithic, both in terms of making tools, but also most possibly being used as an item of exchange across geographies, and we'll see some of that. If you recall this slide that I had, this image in the beginning of the semester, as an assemblage of artifacts, some of which are categorized as monuments, like this Naram Sin stele that you see in the middle from the Akkadian period, or an Assyrian statue of a king, a royal statue. We have pieces like furniture pieces and ivory, carved ivory pieces on the bottom left, a pot with a figural decoration on the top left, a dagger from the royal tombs of Ur that was really prepared in gold, and it's made with these kind of really expensive materials brought in from other regions, but made for a particular burial ritual, or figurines that I'm going to talk a little bit about, and seals. And so we have this kind of really complexity of materials from Near Eastern cultures, and it is often very difficult to work with this category of art, right? Which is a kind of a modern category that is reflected on or kind of imposed on the ancient world. And so I'm going to be working with you in sort of using the appropriate methodologies to respond to such a complexity of artifacts. And how are we going to do this? For example, it's really quite interesting. Let's start with the question of what is art, right? And so I'm hoping for us to devise a very useful definition to go forward, and this is probably one of the most difficult terms to define that is very dominant in our contemporary world. The work of art is a modern concept, and that's really the way that we understand a work of art that is in contemporary art and from the museum world is often assumed and imposed on pre-modern cultures. And that's something that we're going to be sort of try to be a little skeptical about. This has to do, this is a major issue with the status of the artists. Artists were not sort of really these kind of stellar individuals in the ancient world. Oftentimes their names are hidden. It's very hard to get information about them, whether they're architects or artists or craftsmen. Right, and so the main function of art in the society really changes from society to society. So that's going to be a really important thing for us. We never see in the ancient world an artwork that is solely produced for exhibition, for curating, right? And it's the artwork. What we call artwork in the ancient world is always has a kind of a real physical function in the real world. And so we're going to be a little skeptical about this definition, but I'm going to try to kind of really bring in something more inclusive for the ancient world, like the creative and imaginative work of human communities and individuals using their material skills and acquired bodies of knowledge. These are important material skills, technologies, and acquired bodies of knowledge as understood as these artisanal or craft knowledges that is kind of really passed on from one generation to another in order to build a meaningful world around them. This is kind of really my working definition. You're welcome to kind of really critique it, and we can have a discussion in class about this. But I'd like to sort of really keep this on the side in thinking that it's creative and imaginative, but also the idea of technology and materials is very, very fundamental today, fundamental in the ancient world. Although today sometimes it's a performance. You don't even have a material. You don't have a technology. An artist does a performance, and that's artwork. And so in that sense, our work on the ancient cultures is a little hard in kind of really moving beyond our contemporary definitions. One of the interesting statements among anthropologists who study art in pre-modern and non-Western cultures is Alfred Gell, a kind of a really interesting proposal he had in his book Art and Agency. In Art and Agency, he says something like, I view art as a system of action intended to change the world rather than encode symbolic propositions about it. You know, we have this kind of really understanding when you go to an art museum, you look at a piece of art and you say, what is the meaning behind this work of art? Oftentimes there's just kind of really intellectual labor that you have to kind of really get into trying to understand. Actually, Alfred Gell is critiquing that approach a little bit, and he says that artworks in that sense that they don't really need to be encoded with these symbolic propositions of some kind of ideology, some kind of political message. The artwork doesn't really need to have a kind of a verbally pronounceable message, that it is a system of action intended to change the world. It's to make a physical impact on the world. And what do I mean by this? And it's kind of really this shield, for example, that you see on the right, and so which is quite fascinating. He refers to this as not a beautiful shield, but a fear-inducing shield, and so this is really quite interesting example because it's. This is an Asmat shield, and it proposes, Alfred Gell proposes that as art, It is art because it's not because it is beautiful and that it abides by certain aesthetic rules and sensibilities, but because it is effective in serving as a shield. And what is that purpose? The purpose is to protect the person who is carrying this shield in a war, right? And so it is protecting this person, but also it has this intricate design that tricks or impacts their opponent, so that therefore its formal qualities are also mobilized to accomplish this function of protecting its owner. So its design contributes its effectiveness as a shield in that sense. It's not intended for exhibition, it's intended for battle. So that's what I wanted to say. So apart from the category of art, then what research fields then we should be tapping into? And the first is visual culture. We can call this cultures of seeing. This is the world of images, the ways of seeing that is very specific to each culture. And the ways of seeing that is embodied in the image making process, right? The way that we see the world, we kind of really reflect that in the images that we produce. And so, as John Berger would argue, that every image embodies a way of seeing in that sense. And this also includes this idea of a kind of a set of ideas that actually I posted a video that's discussed in a short video that I posted by Renata Hollot, where she talks about the right to sight, the rituals of seeing, the right of sight, and also the sight of sight, the sights of seeing. And this actually refers to the idea that the right of sight, which is that a lot of images are produced in history, but a handful of people actually have access to it. And so imagine a world before the internet, and sort of really precious works of art actually ends up at the time of their making. Very few people had actually seen them. So the right to sight is a kind of a privilege that we have to really take into consideration. The ritual of seeing is the idea that the way that we look at things and objects and artwork and architecture is somehow ritualized, and that there is an etiquette in approaching things. And what is the ritual of seeing, right? What did a Paleolithic man and woman feel when they're deep in the cave, a kilometer into this deep, dark cave, and you have no electric lighting, you have a little candle, maybe a little torch, and you have these sort of flickering lights with dangerous animals depicted on the walls. I mean, it must have been terrifying with these kind of water dripping. It's a kind of a damp, humid environment, and you might be cold and scared and dark, and you're deep in a cave. You don't know if you can go back. You know, those kinds of, so it's really mixed with this idea of the fear. And so this is what we call visual culture. The second is material culture, and I'd like to really talk about this as a culture of making. These involve things, artifacts, objects, tools, rocks, everything that is really that we have an engagement with in our everyday life. We live with things. I have my notebooks here. There's a recording machine here. That's a and so on. And so they accompany us. They help us as tools or as company in our everyday life. What is our relationship with them? So material culture really is about this kind of poetics of making things but also living with things, but they have their own, these objects have their own history, they have their own life. For example, I wear glasses. In my glasses there's this kind of really layered history of optics, centuries and centuries of work about how humans see, right? And in terms of the production of these, I have these progressive lenses that are really complicated. I can look far and see far, and look at my notebook and see my notebook at the same time, although I'm both farsighted and nearsighted. And so it's really quite fascinating. And finally, architecture, cultures of building, and the human practices to construct shelters, houses, public monuments, but also the culturally specific ways that we shape our environment, or we shape the spaces around ourselves and landscapes around ourselves. And I'm showing you an image of the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. This is a 2,000-year-old wall of the Herod the Great's temple on the Temple Mount. And this is a wall that pilgrims have been visiting over thousands of years. And so architecture, in a way, also carries these traces of the past, of memories behind them. So so that part of it is also interesting. So visual culture, material culture, architecture, these are things that we're going to explore in this class. So let's jump in a little bit this fascinating, exciting find from a Neolithic house in south central Turkey from Çatalhöyük. We're going to look at Çatalhöyük in the third lecture as well, but I just wanted us to sort of really get in with an example, with an interesting example to talk about these issues. Çatalhöyük is one of the largest agricultural communities from the Middle East that we know from the Neolithic period, and the Neolithic inhabitants of Çatalhöyük house. This is happening in a house. They dug a hole in the old foundations of a house and laid down a miniature human figure, carved beautifully in marble, this crystallized limestone, and covered with 2 layers of clean sand and clay. They placed a tiny obsidian blade that you see on the right to go with this figurine, and sealed it off with whitewashed clean platform. What does it mean to make a miniature human? What does it signify, the way that we give shape to their bodies and their faces, the way that we represent their sexuality and gender identity? This is a question that is constantly asked and explored by archaeologists, and that's something that we're going to explore as well by archaeologists, art historians, and anthropologists, and I wanted to sort of really bring this up. So this large female figurine, which is about 17 centimeters high, yay high, about 7 inches. It was carved from crystallized limestone, as I mentioned. The representation follows a form of the female body, known from other representations at this site, a nude female body with an overabundance of flesh, showing corpulent limbs, stomach, buttocks, and breasts. The workmanship on the figurine demonstrates that there's a considerable high level of expertise. This is not being carved by a random individual. This is carved by a specialist, clearly, and a complex understanding of the human body. And especially considering the sagging flesh, look at that sagging flesh of the belly. So the raised buttocks, and so we want to ask what is the politics of representation here. People in the past have actually suggested these are mother goddesses or fertility figures, but more recent interpretations are actually pointing us towards an understanding of this as an elderly woman who has given several births and has become a source of accumulated knowledge and wisdom, and probably some kind of a village elder. So let's really, this is a really different kind of work. And in my classes, I explore this. I have another seminar called Material Worlds, and this is one of the things that we do. One of the fun things we do in that seminar is that when we explore this idea of what does it mean to make miniature humans with idealized bodies, and what does it say about the politics of representation of sexuality in general? And I found that a particularly fruitful comparison is this idea of comparing a modern doll, a Barbie doll, with a prehistoric figurine. And especially thinking in those terms. So Barbie dolls equally have impossibly unrealistic human proportions, like that of prehistoric figurines. Perhaps speaking about different body stereotypes, we were talking about two different body stereotypes and ideals that are very much culturally specific. Also, the idea of the doll, which obtains here a performative role. So, if you think of a child's play, when the child is playing with a doll, the play is only possible, is only going to work if you assume that the doll is a real person, right? If you don't assume that the doll is a real person, the play will not work. And so this actually brings in a kind of a really performative role to the doll. So I'm not suggesting that the prehistoric figurines were also dolls, although that's a possibility, but I'm suggesting that this kind of performative aspect of the doll acting as a real person is probably true for the prehistoric figurines as well, whatever purpose they are serving. I don't know. So let's talk a little bit about, so this example also points us the importance of context, right? So what is context? There are different kinds of context. Context is important for us because art historians and archaeologists really, this idea of historical context or cultural context or social context is important for the study of the image because their interpretation, the interpretation of this image and artwork, really dependent on that context, right? And so because of their significance vary very significantly from one context to another. So we have different types of contexts. Then we have cultural context, in which specific culture an object is made, or historical context, the time period in which it is made and used. Architectural context, where it is found, where it was located. Imagine Sistine Chapel and that particular sort of painting in the dome. You know, that is going to really, that context is really, that architectural context is very, very important. And the environmental context in which a particular monument or artwork exists. So the works of art are always belong to some kind of a temporal or geographical context, and they display the historical, sociocultural aspects of that context. So when we study an object, we have to study it with respect to this context. We can't really study them on their own. They can't really speak to us with their form, with their own materials, technologies. We have to consider them in relation to their context. And oftentimes that these then, because of that context, we also understand objects, ancient objects, particularly historical objects, as representatives of their own particular episode. This is how they made figurines in the prehistoric Middle East, for example, you know. So it starts to represent to us a particular historical process, a particular historical context. And then these works of art then also mobilize to illustrate a kind of a development of artistic styles and technologies. Often they are kind of really worked into some kind of an evolutionary model, which is not always correct and sometimes correct. But you know, art historians write these stories of how particular styles and technologies develop over time with the help of these objects. That's why the context is also the historical context, the chronological context is very, very important. Speaking of chronology, let's talk a little bit about chronology here. Chronology of art historical time. And we are, in this class, we're going to be mostly talking about years before Christ or before the Common Era, starting with, you know, the figurine I was showing you is about 7,600 years before the Common Era. That is used, and more conventionally, the term before Christ, before the year zero, has been used a long time. And so nowadays, archaeologists are starting to use BCE instead, before the Common Era. And sometimes you might run into BP, which would stand for before present. And that's usually used for more geological time periods or really distant time periods, where BC is not going to make sense very much, but from before the present. And usually 1970 is taken as the standard present, although now it's 50 years old. And so it's very important for us to see, if you're talking about the years between 100 to 0 BC, you're talking about the first century BCE. Between 200 and 100, you're talking about the second century BCE. 300 to 200, you're talking about the third century BCE. So year 250 BCE would be the middle of the third century. So that's really important. And then I'll be talking about first millennium, second millennium, third millennium BCE. And that's going to refer to these kind of 1,000-year-long periods. The third millennium generally, and second millennium is the Bronze Age in the Middle East, and the first millennium is going to be the Iron Age. And we'll get there as well. But I wanted to sort of bring this chronology as a guide for us to particularly use. So this brings me the final general question of what is an image, because in the next lecture I'm going to talk about this idea of what is an image in respect to the Paleolithic cave paintings, and ask the question, what does an image do? When you have an image like this, with multiple people having this kind of imprint of their hands and arms on the wall 30,000 years ago, what does this signify? And as one of my colleagues, Rebecca Schneider, has called this, is this some kind of a hailing from the bust? And this could be really interesting. I mean, I put these hands because of the metaphor of hailing, but this can be also thought more generally, more broadly about ancient images. And so there is, in the next couple of lectures, I want to share with you a number of arguments, and this is the sort of really, I'm wrapping up the lecture here. One is this argument is that there's an interest in prehistoric art in depicting wild and ferocious animals. We don't exactly know why, but it seems that they're really in these cave paintings and other representations later also in the Neolithic, that they're very much interested in wild and ferocious animals, and that this representation actually makes the image potent and powerful, and then the spaces in which they exist are potent and powerful. This is an important component. And secondly, the animal-human hybrids. Human bodies are sometimes hybridized with animal bodies, and you see these kind of weird monsters that David Wengrow calls fictive anatomies. And we have these kind of lion man type of figures. And what is the purpose of this? And this, the importance of these images is that they put a really interesting question about this fundamental divide we have between humans and animals as different ontologies of bodily form, but maybe that kind of separation was not so much there in antiquity. Third is that representation of some of the human bodies that we see in the prehistoric figurines are that they're explicitly gendered and their sexuality is marked. In what way this happens, we're going to really discuss with voluptuous bodies, these pendulous breasts, sometimes erect penises, marked genitalia. And these representations actually attempt to portray some kind of a bodily ideal. And what is that bodily ideal? We will discuss. And finally, the consciousness of death. I wanted to really talk about how this kind of idea of the afterlife and death really develops in the Neolithic societies, because what we find is that Neolithic communities bury their dead in their houses, and oftentimes they would bring them up again. They will dig up their bones and retreat those bones and inter them again, which means that there's a constant sort of communication with dead ancestors, your dead grandmother or dead grandfather. What is that relationship? That's something that we will explore as well. So that's all for the first video. And in the second video, we're going to turn to the Upper Paleolithic. Thank you.